Hello, everybody. Professor Barth here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to part 3 of the World of Thucydides. This is part of a new playlist entitled Foundations of Western Political Thought. If you haven't already seen part 1, you're going to want to do so. Thucydides, the great historian of ancient Greece. And then also you're going to want to check out part 2, where we explore Thucydides' view of human nature. War is a violent teacher, Thucydides tells us. Well, today we're going to examine two radically different visions of political economy. On the one hand, we have Athens, a sea power, a great commercial power, a democracy, a civilization of high art, philosophy, literature, culture. And then on the other hand, Sparta, a land-based power, an oligarchy, a militarist state, a decidedly uncommercial, even anti-commercial state, one that rejected luxury and championed austerity, simplicity, martial discipline, and virtue. These are the two powers that faced off in the epic Peloponnesian War, described for us by Thucydides, which took place between 431 and 404 BC. Athens was at the head of the Delian League, and Sparta was at the head of an alliance called the Peloponnesian League. Two powers who had allied to defeat the invading Persians in the Greco-Persian War, which took place from 499 to 449 BC, half-century-long war. They united to defeat the Persians, but then naval Athens, land-based Sparta, as Thucydides described, an inevitable conflict erupted between the two. Now, the Delian League was headed by Athens. It was focused on the Aegean Sea. Athens was the dominant power in the Aegean Sea. It was actually formulated during the Greco-Persian Wars in 478 BC. Members of the League contributed funds in the form of ships, men, weapons, sometimes money. It was named the Delian League because meetings took place on the island of Delos in the middle of the Aegean Sea. But very quickly, Athens came to just utterly dominate the league. And it was clear, especially after the Greco-Persian War concluded and the league persisted onward, that this was not really so much a league as an empire, an Athenian empire. Athens began to use the league's funds for its own purposes, increasing its navy, new building projects such as the Parthenon. And as a result, many of the members of the league came to resent Athenian hegemony. Other powers within the league became quasi or de facto colonies of Athens. By the way, the one island in the Aegean Sea that was free from Athenian control for a time was the island of Melos, and we'll take a look at the Melian dialogues later in a future lecture. And Athens, what a naval power she was. Of course, Athens was famous for these triremes, a warship, a galley of 3 tiers of oars, usually consisted of 170 or so oarsmen, and then a dozen or sometimes 24 hoplites or foot soldiers, and a few archers. And naval warfare in these days consisted of the trireme ramming the enemy ship and then the infantry boarding that enemy ship and taking it over. Athens was second to none when it came to naval might. And so between the end of the Greco-Persian War in 449 and the onset of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC, Athens enters this grand golden age, the mid-5th century, in which Athenian power and glory was on full display for the Mediterranean world. The Parthenon was built with Delian League funds between 447 and 432 BC. And here's a artistic recreation of rendering of what the Parthenon may have looked like at that time. This is brought to you by Assassin's Creed, the video game, which I've never played, but they have some pretty delightful images on DuckDuckGo if you search Athens and Parthenon. Grand structure. The Acropolis was built during this time period. Those magnificent structures that remain standing today. Just fantastic. Here's a modern photograph of the Acropolis in Athens. What a civilization. Fantastic. The city walls. The culture. A democratic culture. More on that in a moment. The marketplaces. A very commercial society. Trade. Money. If you watch my History of Money lecture series, I have an entire lecture on Greek coinage. Well, the Athenians had, of course, a coinage, as did other Greek city-states. But Athens was the preeminent commercial power in that 5th century Greek world. And it was a world of learning, of education. You see a musician pictured here, of writing, literacy, literature, poetry. What we might call today a liberal arts education, philosophy. This was the age of Socrates. Socrates lived from 470 BC to 399 BC. And it was the age of Pericles. Pericles, that great Athenian general turned statesman. Pericles was the most influential figure in Athenian politics. He rose to prominence, political prominence, Before that, he rose to military prominence, but he rose to political prominence around 461 BC. And for the next 3 decades, Pericles was, as Thucydides termed it, the first citizen of Athens. Pericles was a Democrat, through and through. And he was a very effective Democrat. Pericles dominated Athenian politics and Athenian democracy. You could call Pericles a populist. He appealed directly to the masses. And that word democracy comes from the Greek word for demos, which means people, but also kratos. Kratos, power. So democracy really means people power, or power by the people. And in Athenian democracy, a simple majority ruled, so 51% could decide. Also, this was a direct democracy. A direct democracy, meaning you didn't vote for representatives, you actually attended the assembly, or the ecclesia was the Greek word, the ecclesia, which is where we get church, actually, the ecclesiastical. The church in the early days was an assembly of believers, the ecclesia, ecclesiastical. Well, in ancient Athens and Golden Age Athens, the ecclesia was the assembly, the forum, where Athenian citizens gathered and voted. And they voted by show of hands, or sometimes he voted with a stone, a white or a black stone, and he would vote, drop it in a clay jar, and the votes were counted. But this was a wide franchise, very wide franchise. Participation in Athenian democracy was open to all adult male citizens over the age of 20 who had completed their military training. Now, not all adult males were citizens, but it amounted to about 30% of the adult population. During this golden age, perhaps as many as 60,000 citizens in Athens had a right to vote. That was out of a population of about 300,000 in all of Attica. Attica was the region was Athens and then the surrounding region. So out of 300,000 people total, that includes children and slaves, 60,000 adult males were citizens and had the right to vote, and they would assemble at this ecclesia. Here's a picture of a photograph of the very site in Athens where they assembled You see the Parthenon in the distance? And it was a large assembly. Quorum was 6,000 people. At least 6,000 people had to be there, and oftentimes it exceeded 6,000. So imagine that. 6,000 plus citizens gathered, voting by show of hands or by stones. There were about 10 assembly meetings every year, and voting, attendance and voting, was seen as a duty. Good citizens participated. Now, if you were at war, you obviously couldn't attend, but otherwise you were expected to attend. Now, Athenian government was more than just the assembly. You also had various office holders. You had a council of 500 who took on various administrative forms like finance and various daily affairs of the city. This was a rotating office. You served a one-year term because it was quite time-intensive. One-year term, and then you were done. Members were chosen by lot in order to prevent cabals, factions from banding together in order to seize political power. There was a elaborate court system in ancient Athens with a magistrate, but also a massive jury. Juries were sometimes as many as 200 to 500 jurors. You also had slavery in Athens, and it was widespread. Maybe about a third of the Athenian population was enslaved. About 100,000 people in all of Attica. Household servants worked in agriculture, and these Athenian slaves oftentimes were war captives that they were total property. They could be bought, sold, passed down after the master's death. Now, in Athens' defense, slavery was a universal institution in that time in human history, and actually slavery was a universal institution all the way up until the early modern period. The 19th century really is when slavery really began to dissipate. Prior to that, slavery was everywhere. But what's unique here is that you have democracy plus slavery. That's really one of the first instances of that. Now, Athens was not the only democracy in this period, nor was it the first, but it was by far the most prominent and had the most citizens participating in it. So what a civilization. Impressive. Now, Thucydides, as you'll recall, I elaborated upon this in the second lecture, so you'll watch part 2. So I won't repeat myself much here, but Thucydides is very critical of Athenian democracy. He believed that people were too credulous, ignorant, public opinion was fickle, they were prone to mob rule. The demos, Thucydides said, requires strong leadership, which opens the way for potential demagogues to jump in and manipulate public opinion. And actually, if you look at the historiography, up through until the 19th century, Athens was seen as an example of why democracy is a failed political system. Athenian democracy was extremely turbulent. It was disorderly. There were many failures about it. Socrates was killed by Athenian democracy in 399. It was said that he corrupted the minds of the youth. Plato and Aristotle were very critical of democracy. The founding fathers pointed to Athens as an example of why total 100% democracy can't work. That's why we have a mixed government in our constitution. It's really not until the 19th century that Athenian democracy was championed as this great thing. Prior to the 19th century, democracy was just assumed. It's collective tyranny, it's mob rule, it's unjust. And Thucydides certainly has his criticisms. Now, Thucydides says democracy can work with strong leadership, with virtuous leadership, and he sees that in Pericles. So Pericles is Athenian democracy thrives during that golden age because it had strong leadership, because of Pericles. But when Pericles dies in 429 BC, early on in the Peloponnesian War, due to the plague, when Pericles dies in 429, he's followed by foolish demagogues who wreck Athenian democracy and show it to be a failure. So there's Athens. What a civilization. Pretty incredible. That Delian League, that Athenian Empire. Well, what about the Peloponnesian League? The Peloponnese is the peninsula here, southern Greece. This, too, was an association of Greek city-states, but under the leadership of Sparta. Nevertheless, unlike the Delian League, Sparta was not the only major power in the League. It was certainly the leading power. In fact, a Congress of the League could only be called by Sparta. But you had other powers. There's the famous Spartan land army, those phalanx brigades, the rectangular mass formation of heavy infantry. So you have that element. Sparta is the foremost power in the Peloponnesian League, but it has allies. As Corinth, if you look here, Corinth lays between Attica. There's Athens, Attica, and the Peloponnese. There's Corinth. There's Thebes. Corinth was a very wealthy city, a very commercial city, a city with an exceptionally strong navy. Sparta doesn't really have much of a navy to speak of. And so this alliance made sense. Corinth was a rival to Athens. Sparta needs that naval power, and so the two made splendid allies for a time. Eventually, Corinth and Sparta will break. But here's ancient Corinth, the Corinthians, Spartan allies, members of the Peloponnesian League during the Peloponnesian War. There's the Corinthian money, the coinage, very, very commercial power. Thebes, again, brought to you by Assassin's Creed. Thebes, also commercial power with the coinage of money. But Sparta is that leading member of the Peloponnesian League. In the documents, you'll see Sparta is sometimes referred to as Lacedaemon. It refers to the same thing. It's the same city-state. Sparta, Lacedaemon. Spartans, the Lacedaemonians, are the same people, the same city-state. Sparta, there's Lacedaemonians. We don't know much about Sparta from the Spartans themselves. The Spartans discouraged record keeping. So much of what we know about Sparta comes from non-Spartans, which is a bit problematic because we have to consider source biases. Nevertheless, we have a pretty good idea of how Spartan society functioned, how its government functioned, how its military functioned. Of course, Sparta known for those massive land armies. It's a land power. The hoplites, those foot soldiers armed with shield and spear. Sparta's constitution, according to legend, derived from a Spartan legislator named Lycurgus. Now, whether or not Lycurgus actually existed is a bit beyond the point. But according to legend, in the 9th century BC, Lycurgus established this Spartan constitution designed to focus all social institutions in Spartan society to military training, to physical training. And Lycurgus desired and informed this constitution to emphasize austerity, frugality, self-discipline, rigor. Lycurgus condemned luxury and refinement. Lycurgus believed, according to legend, that luxury and refinement softened a people. He wanted a strong, military, masculine society. And so commerce and trade, Lycurgus wanted nothing of it. And again, not whether or not Lycurgus actually existed, the Spartan way of life certainly followed this tradition. Spartan citizens were prohibited from possessing gold and silver coin. There was no coinage in Sparta. They believed money was a corrupting force, corrupting influence. Spartans Spartan citizens, which were called Spartiates, were prohibited from engaging in trade or manufacturing. You just could not engage in trade or manufacturing if you were a Spartan citizen. Now, a Spartan citizen was an elite group who could trace their ancestry all the way back to the original inhabitants of the city. You had other people within Sparta who were free inhabitants. They weren't slave, but they also weren't citizens. They were free inhabitants, and they could engage in some trade or manufacturing, but they didn't make up the elite. They weren't full citizens. And even our own English language today tells us a bit about Spartan culture. The word Spartan means simple, frugal, avoiding luxury and comfort. The word laconic, Laconic, means terse, blunt, concise, using few words, not dressing your speech in eloquence. Conspicuous wealth in Lacedaemon was not just discouraged, but condemned. Again, it had a softening effect. It had a corrupting effect, according to Spartan society. Sparta was also an oligarchy. There was no democracy in Sparta. An oligarchy means rule by the few. And according to Spartan theory, an oligarchy was preferable first to democracy, because democracy is way too turbulent. It's ruled by the mob, by the masses, the ignorant, credulous masses. But it also wasn't, according to Spartan theory, a tyranny. A tyranny they defined as a lawless, self-interested reign. Spartan oligarchy was neither lawless nor, supposedly in theory, self-interested. It comprised of two hereditary kings, so not a monarchy, but a diarchy. Two hereditary kings, one specialized in military affairs, the other in civilian affairs. And also a council of elders who were made up of nobility. And they comprised the government, the oligarchical government, and they ruled, in theory, on behalf of the public good. And the Spartans were well known for their education. Spartiates, that is citizens. If you had a boy, at age 7, that son was separated from his parents, joined communal quarters, and then for the next decade focused rigorously on just extremely intense military training, discipline, strength training, fasting. Separated from parents at age 7. There's a heavily collectivist, communal element to ancient Sparta. There was some reading and writing involved as well, but the focus is on physical training, on martial virtues and martial discipline. Athens also had some physical training, of course, but Athens is much more focused on again, the liberal arts, on rhetoric and study of Homer. And in Athens, military service was required at age 18, but Sparta is a totally different ballgame. Sparta is all about military training. And if you were a Spartan citizen, a male citizen, you were required to join the military service, and you did not leave military service until age 30. And whoa, it produced quite a fearsome fighting force. I mean, the Spartans were, when it came to land armies, were second to none. The Spartans also, in the same spirit, developed what you might call, perhaps anachronistically, but sort of eugenics type program in which when a boy was born, a boy baby, the baby was judged whether or not he was fit for future military service, and if the baby was seen as unfit, the baby was abandoned. So proto-eugenics. Also, before going off to war, a Spartan soldier, a hoplite, was required to have a male son so that you could have the next generation of Spartan warriors, because the only people who were able to join the Spartan army. Spartan soldiers had to be Spartan citizens, again, descendants of the original inhabitants of Sparta. And so one problem that the Spartans ran into is that you had an ever-decreasing supply of Spartan soldiers because of that stiff requirement. They had attempted to encourage more and more childbearing as a result, but didn't work out very well for the Spartans. You had the Greco-Persian Wars, and then you had the Peloponnesian Wars that depleted the Spartan armies over time. But, so that's Spartan men. But also Spartan women. Spartan women were enjoyed a remarkable degree of freedom and even equality in Spartan society. Spartan women received an extensive education, far more than women in Athens. Reading, writing. In fact, Spartan women were probably the most literate group of women in the ancient world. Highly literate. They also were free to engage in conversation with men. They could walk freely in outdoor spaces. Their education also included gymnastics and physical training. And they were highly esteemed. Why? Highly esteemed as childbearers, as the mothers of new Spartan warriors who would fight for the Spartan way of life. There's a bronze statue of a Spartan woman engaged in physical activity. Spartan women highly, highly esteemed as the mothers of Spartan warriors. You look today at the war on women being waged by the woke left, the newspeak of birthing persons and chest feeding and menstruating persons, just how gross and insulting that is to women. Robbing women of that sublime distinctive that separates them from men, that superpower, that incredible superpower of giving birth, of producing life, that life power. The war on women that we see today, in which you hear, oh, men can get pregnant too. What a gross and insulting, obscene, denigration of womanhood that represents. Well, the Spartans had a very high view of women, and they had a very high view of men. Highly esteemed women, highly esteemed men. They appreciated men and the strength and the virtues required in men. A society of strong men, a society of strong women. And a society of slavery. In Sparta, there was a very extraordinarily large slave population. Slaves also known as helots, may have outnumbered free Spartan citizens 7-1. And this created all sorts of problems for the Spartans. As the slave population became greater and greater, helot revolts became a greater threat, more frequent. The helots worked as household servants, in agriculture. And so that was a constant issue that the Spartans had to deal with. So this was a strictly stratified society of Spartiates, so Spartan citizens, and free inhabitants who weren't citizens, who had a monopoly of trade and manufacturing, and then below that, this large slave population. Ancient Sparta, Lacedaemon. So, closing today, one more final point on Sparta. There has developed, really since the ancient world, this phenomenon that people have referred to as laconophilia. Now, I think most of us will look at Sparta and find a lot of things to admire about Sparta. I sure do. I think there are things to admire about Sparta, but I also think there are some really big issues. Okay, not just the eugenics aspect, but I would say also it's too collectivist. It's too communistic for me. And I think in any objectively free society. But laconophilia moves beyond just admiration of certain elements to this very acute love of Spartan culture and of the Spartan constitution. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens loses that war. Spoiler alert. Athens loses that war. After the Peloponnesian War, many Greek philosophers, including Plato, especially Plato, the Platonist, viewed Sparta as an almost ideal state of strength, of bravery. They admired that Sparta rejected the corrupting influence of commerce and money. Later, German writers were intensely admired Sparta in the 19th and, of course, into the 20th century. But it wasn't just a right-wing phenomenon. Actually, the love for Sparta, laconophilia, transcends left-right boundaries. Rousseau was an intense admirer of Sparta. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we'll look at later in this course, Rousseau I've often referred to as the intellectual grandfather of the left. Rousseau is firmly on the left in every way. We'll see that later when we get to Rousseau. Well, Rousseau had this to say. Rousseau authored an essay called Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, in which he argued that arts and sciences corrupt human nature. He argued against a view of progress in terms of a progression of the arts and sciences, and he uses Athens versus Sparta to support his thesis. In the very bosom of Greece herself, Rousseau says, there arose a city, Sparta, which became famous through a happy ignorance and wisdom of her laws. Oh, happy ignorance describes Sparta. A commonwealth peopled rather by demigods than men. So far did their virtue outshine humanity, a virtuous society, though ignorant of the arts and sciences, willfully ignorant of the arts and sciences. O Sparta, Rousseau tells us, thou proof of the folly of vain learning. The folly of vain learning. Whilst all manner of vice led by the arts and sciences were introduced into Athens, whilst a tyrant was busy in picking up the works of the prince of poets, speaking of Alexander the Great, thou wert chasing from thy walls all sciences, all learning together with their professors. It's all vanity, Rousseau tells us through the example of Sparta. Athens became the manor of politeness and fine taste, the seat of eloquence and philosophy. The elegance of their buildings corresponded with that of their language. 'Twas from Athens that all those surprising works, which will forever be models for all corrupted ages, have sprung. So Athens leaves this large legacy, this large record. The buildings, those glorious buildings of Athens, what do they testify to? For models for what? All virtuous ages? No, models for all corrupted ages, Rousseau tells us. The picture of Lacedaemon is not so brilliant. There, said all other nations, there, men are born virtuous. The very air of that country seems to inspire virtue. Nothing remains of that people but the tradition of their heroic actions. Sparta is what a truly free society looks like. You might be tempted to see Sparta as barbaric, as savage. Not so much. Don't be so quick to say that, to think that, Rousseau tells us. It's Sparta where virtue is found, not Athens. And so these two radically different visions of political economy continue to divide philosophers and political thinkers across the political spectrum. And they face off in the Peloponnesian War. Now, for part 4, we're going to take a look at Pericles and the speeches recorded for us by Thucydides, his funeral oration and his last speech. There's a lot that we can glean from that, some fantastic material and lessons from those two speeches. So we'll take a look at Pericles and the Peloponnesian War for part 4. See you then. God bless.